Yeah. I still want to be right next to the screen.
All right, everybody, we're gonna get started here. It's I guess I could just start talking for a little while and see if anybody listens. Welcome to the Forest Health session. I have a couple housekeeping announcements to make before we get started with the presentations, which I'm very excited for. But housekeeping announcements, number one, the raffle closes at 3. So when we leave this session, you'll have last minute chance to go put your tickets in. So that's housekeeping number one. Housekeeping number two is that the tour tomorrow that was going to be at the Catamount Community Forest is actually going to be at the Heinsberg Town Forest. So just file that away in your brain if that's where you're headed tomorrow. So Ethan Tapper is going to be at Heinsberg, not at Catamount. So with that, We have 2 talks today. We'll have some time for questions in between them. But first is going to be Dode Gladders, who serves as the field specialist in natural resources in Sullivan County, New Hampshire, just across a river from where I am, which is great. A position also referred to as the Sullivan County Forester. Before starting at UNH a little over a decade ago, he managed the forest health program for the state of Delaware and taught dendrology at Delaware State University. He also worked as a field forester in timber industry for several years in the Pacific Northwest and has a master's degree in forest resources from the University of Georgia. And he's going to give us a talk called What in the Woods Is That?
All right. Thanks, Alex. Thank you all for being here. Can you guys all hear me in the back? All right, good. So as a forester with some extra background in forest health, one thing that I found helpful is to have a forest health person's perspective in forestry. So I'm going to show you guys a bunch of stuff that you probably have seen walking around the woods all the time. You may know what some of these things are. I don't think anybody will know what everything is, but my goal is to show you guys 1 or 2 or 3 high quality pictures, diagnostic pictures of each of these things, and just tell you just a little bit about it to install that mental search image in your mind so that next time you see it, you'll say, Dode told me what that was. I'll go look it up in the presentation online. So without further ado. So when I first moved here, I saw this, and I moved here in 2013. I interviewed the week that emerald ash borer was found in New Hampshire for the first time, but I had nothing to do with it. But I came up here and I saw this, and I realized immediately this is not blonding. This is not from woodpeckers. This is not emerald ash borer, because I recognized it from my last job in Delaware. There's it's called smooth patch disease, also known by Kyle Lombard at the time as natural blonding. And I saw this on white oak all the time. And so this is just a saprophytic fungus digesting the dead outer bark layers and creating a smoother layer. And it looks very much like 1 or 2-year-old blonding on ash, right? It looks very similar, but this is blonding on ash. And so if this were emerald ash borer, you would always have on the blonding surface holes a little bit smaller than a dime, half an inch deep, where they've extracted some of the larvae as well. So you will never have that on smooth patch. And if you look up smooth patch disease, the first host listed is white oak and the second is white ash. We just didn't have any white ash in Delaware, so I hadn't seen it before. So sticking with ash for a second, and these are all in no particular order. We have a lot of reports of ash borer come in as other members of that family, Buprestidae family, but there are plenty of native ones. So we see a lot of these on hardwoods in summertime. The one on the right is probably the one I see the most, Dicerca divaricata, also members of the genus Buprestis. We also have some members of the same, not just family, but actually the same genus as emerald ash borer, the Gryllus. So bronze birch borer, 2-line chestnut borer, some other ones. They leave the distinctive D-shaped exit holes. They look just like the adult beetles. They're just different colors. Leave the same kinds of S-shaped frass-packed galleries under the bark, but they're native and they're all secondary pests, which means what? Something else is already wrong, right? The tree is stressed by drought, injury, something else is going on, and it's just taking advantage of that and accelerating that decline. Ash rust is something we see around the seacoast. So a lot of the rust diseases have secondary or alternate hosts. It's a mistake that's made a lot, I think, to say that all rusts have other hosts. That's not true at all. There are plenty of rusts that do not have other hosts. But ash rust does. The other host is Spartina grass, which grows in brackish water. So the closer you get to the seacoast, the more likely you are to have this if you have the right weather conditions and wind direction in the springtime when the spores are moving around. And so it causes the leaves to shrivel up and crinkle, and you get these distinctive fruiting bodies on the undersides of the leaves. If your vision is pretty good, you can see these fruiting bodies. They look like little orange upside down cups, 1 or 2 millimeters in diameter. And they're puffing out spores that will go and infect Spartina grass. Plenty of other rust diseases around. We've all seen these blueberry, the witch's brooms and blueberry, right? What's the alternate host for that? Balsam fir. So the spores that come off of those structures can only infect balsam fir. And the spores that are produced on balsam fir only infect blueberry. Cedar apple rust alternates between juniperous, so junipers or red cedar, and malus, which is apple or crab apple. So the structure is the size of a softball. Those gummy worm-looking orange things are called teleal horns. And spores are going to be produced from there in the springtime. They can only infect the upper surface of malus leaves. Then it grows and develops through the leaf during the growing season, produces fruiting bodies, structures on the undersides of the apple leaves. And those spores can only infect juniperus, creating these structures next year. Pretty cool. This is glossy buckthorn. A few years ago, we had a lot of rust on glossy buckthorn. The alternate host is oats, oat grasses. I was hoping it would knock it back. It was on the fruit, it was on the petioles, it's everywhere, but it didn't seem to slow it down at all. Is glossy buckthorn a problem in your states as well? Yeah, it's a big one in New Hampshire. So this is rust. These are fruiting bodies on balsam fir needles on the undersides. These are actually white. Most rust spores and fruiting bodies are orange, orangish brown, hence the common name. This is fir fern rust, though. The alternate host is various ferns. And then we have this. These are witch's brooms in balsam fir. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, but this does not do any real damage to balsam fir trees, but it's a big problem if you're trying to grow Christmas trees and they have lots of these witch's brooms in them. Nobody's going to buy this scary thing. The alternate host is chickweed, and so Christmas tree growers do what they have to do to not have chickweed in the plantation. We also have various anthracnose diseases in our different hardwood species. So different fungi cause disease in beech, oak, sycamore, birch, ash. And they each have a pretty specific ideal set of environmental conditions in the spring. And so they're looking for the right temperature window in the spring when the leaves are developing. And when the leaves are developing and expanding, they don't have the waxy cuticle to cover them and protect them from infection. So if you're in that window, say for example, beech anthracnose maybe prefers a temperature range of 50 to 60 degrees in the spring. So if you have that and your leaves get wet and they stay wet for 4 hours, let's say, that's enough time for the fungus to land on the wet leaf surface, basically germinate and get into the leaf. And after that, it doesn't matter if the leaf dries out. Once it's inside, environmental conditions don't matter anymore. If it dries out before 4 hours happen in this example, that spore will not successfully cause infection. So it has a whole lot to do with weather conditions this spring and much, much less to do with how bad it was last year. None of our anthracnose diseases that we have here are things I would call serious, though, but we do get a lot of calls about them. Don't know if you guys had this in your state, but maybe 3 or 4 years ago, when I was covering in Cheshire County before our forester started there, there were oak terminals everywhere, all over the roads, the fields, anywhere that it was windy. And this is caused by the larva of a beetle called the oak twig pruner. And it's easy to diagnose. You pick up a fallen terminal and you look at the end of it, you'll have an oval shaped cavity inside if it's oak twig pruner, and you don't need to do any more investigation. So it basically is weakening the twig by hollowing it out. And then you get a strong wind and the twigs break. It's nothing to worry about, but one of those things that's quite alarming if you don't know what's going on and all of a sudden your tree doesn't have any tips anymore. We've all seen hemlock trees that look like this, right? So this is a native relative of emerald ash borer called the hemlock borer. The larval stage is under the bark, just like emerald ash borer, making galleries, doing its mechanical damage, and the woodpeckers figure it out. And they do the same thing they do with ash. So this is blonding on hemlock. The inner bark of hemlock is this color. You can see the holes where they've pulled out some of the larvae as well. You'll see a lot of the sloughed off bark around the base of these trees. This is always secondary. There's always something else going on. With hemlock, it's going to be either drought or some injury, or maybe insect infestation like hemlock woolly adelgid or hemlock looper. I don't know if folks have seen this. Acorn pipgall wasp. A few years ago, this was our #1 reported pest in the whole state of New Hampshire through the NH bugs reporting system. People would find acorns falling off really early in the summertime. If you look at these acorns, there's a triangular sort of wedge-shaped gall where the cap and the acorn come together. The larva develops inside. The acorn becomes non-viable and it falls off early. It's not really doing any significant damage. Probably you're not going to have a lot of reproductive potential that year or the next year. And what's interesting is I know a hunter who baits, uses natural bait, he uses apples and other stuff. And he was baiting with acorns that year. And he said that every single acorn that had a pipgall wasp infestation, the gall, was not eaten by the deer and bears that he was baiting for. So they're pretty smart. What do you think this invasive shrub is? I already said it once, but it's glossy buckthorn. This is July. Glossy buckthorn is not supposed to look like this in July. So a few years ago, all our glossy buckthorn in certain parts of the state pretty much looked like this. It's just an oddball narrow-wing moth that, for whatever reason, the population was up that year. A lot of these native diseases and predators that keep pests or that keep native pests in check most years. If something's out of whack one year, if the environmental conditions are just wrong for those predators, then you'll see a bump up in that pest. And everybody's calling, everybody's noticing something is defoliated that's not usually defoliated, or there are caterpillars everywhere. But in general, with native pests, it's nothing to worry about because it's quite likely that whatever normally keeps it in check is going to be keeping it in check next year. And you're not going to see it again until 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. And I had high hopes for this too, because something that defoliates something in June or July, going to get rid of the glossy buckthorn, but it didn't do a thing. So northern tooth fungus, we've all seen this. I just put this up because a couple of reasons, but it's kind of a neat guy. You see these layers in sugar maple, these layered structures. Most mushrooms, if you look at the bottom, either have gills or pores. This doesn't. It's a tooth mushroom. It has teeth on the underside, which is pretty unusual. And then I also put this in, sugar maple borer. This is a native longhorn beetle, native cerambycid. It goes after generally stressed maple trees. Usually doesn't kill them, but it causes this injury. It looks like a mechanical injury going across the stem, up and across at an angle. But Alex mentioned that I taught dendrology, and I always used to teach my students, use everything that you have available to identify trees. So smell them, look at the bark, buds, leaves, but also know the insects and diseases that infest them. So I've only ever seen northern tooth on sugar maple, and occasionally, I'm going to admit it, sugar maple and red maple can look a little confusing if they're right next to each other and you can't see the buds and it's wintertime. Northern tooth absolutely rules out red maple. It's sugar maple if you have northern tooth. If you have sugar maple borer, there's a 100% chance that that's a sugar maple tree. Poplar satin moth, PSM. This is another one that every once in a while, populations bump up and we see it defoliating quickly defoliating pretty much all populous species. So Hybrid poplars would be the number one thing. That's what these are, planted hybrid poplars. Used a lot for windbreaks. Also see it on cottonwood and sometimes even in the woods on bigtooth and quaking aspen. And the first time that I had a report, somebody sent this in and said, is this a glorified gypsy moth? Just a jumbo gypsy moth, and before the name was changed to spongy moth, but it does look a little bit like it. It's a big hairy caterpillar. There's some specialized caterpillar eaters, cuckoo birds, for example, that populations sort of follow these guys around sometimes. While we're on populace, I wanted to put this one up because it's easy to diagnose and I see it all the time. Have you guys ever seen this? These big swollen galls where the petiole attaches to a leaf of poplar leaf. It's called poplar petiole gall aphid. So there's a developing aphid insect inside there. But it's kind of interesting because I believe that this does alternate with cruciferous vegetables. So if you're growing cabbage next to your broccoli, next to your woods line, you may see more poplar petiole gall aphid activity. So needle cast diseases, we're all familiar with some of the needle cast diseases, but I just want to point out there's basically a needle cast disease or more than one for every conifer that we have. So the tree on the left is Colorado blue spruce. So that's Rhizosphaera needle cast. The tree on the right is some kind of true fir on a Christmas tree plantation in Richmond, New Hampshire. The number one needle cast of true fir would be Liriula. But I put these two pictures up because this is pretty easy to diagnose too with a picture or in the field because of the pattern, right? Needle cast diseases are always worse lower towards the ground and in the middle for several reasons. Number one, you're going to have more spores there because spores are falling down. But number two, it's moister. There's less sun, less airflow. It's a more favorable environment for fungal pathogens. So as you go up the tree, it looks better. And both of those trees look fine at the top and they look terrible at the bottom. And in between, you can see that something's wrong. What's really happening is when weather conditions are right in the spring, like I was talking about with anthracnose, those expanding first-year needles are getting infected. But these fungi take a whole year to develop inside the needle. In the following season, this is actually the damage. You can see these fruiting bodies plugging the stomata on the undersides of the needles. So they're physically plugging the stomata where the water should be evaporating during photosynthesis. And so the tree basically can't use those needles, and so it sheds them or casts them. So you're always going to have the current year needles, but you may not have more than the current year needles. So oak shot hole leaf miner, have you guys ever seen oak leaves that look like this? Look like somebody shot them with a BB gun. So this is actually a fly. And the female fly, right about now or in a couple weeks, she pierces the sort of embryonic expanding leaves, the buds. They're just starting to get going. She pierces them with her ovipositor and then consumes the sweet sap that comes out. And so since the leaves are so tiny, that tiny hole that she makes as the leaves expand, the holes get bigger and sort of drop out, and you get this is totally harmless. There's nothing you need to do about it. But if you see leaves, oak leaves that look like this, that's what it's going to be. It'll hold those leaves. That's plenty of photosynthetic surface area. Yeah. Another one, kind of the same lines, but maple leaf cutter. It makes holes in maple leaves. This is the larval stage of a moth, native moth, that cuts these circular discs off of the maple leaves and sort of glues them around itself as like a sandwich, so it can eat in safety. And then later in the year, later in the fall, they'll drop down and finish their life cycle in the soil. Doesn't do a lot of damage. I think we know, but most of a tree's growth is done by early to mid-July for all practical purposes. So anything that's causing leaves to drop after mid-July is not a serious problem for trees. Nothing I can think of anyway. So we have ambrosia beetles. These tend to be about the size of a grain of rice, give or take 50%. But unlike bark beetles, which go in and sort of wander and make galleries under the bark like ash borer a little bit, ambrosia beetles go straight in. And as they go in, they push out a frass tube behind them. And that frass tube can grow to be 3 or 4 inches long or even longer. It looks like toothpicks sticking out of a tree. And then when the wind blows or as soon as it rains, those frass tubes are broken apart, but you'll find that very fine frass at the base of a tree. So when you see fine frass like that, like flour, you can know that it was made by a small beetle, like not a big longhorn beetle that'll make more frass like sawdust. So it's small beetle, small frass. Most ambrosia beetles are not a big deal, but some of them do vector fungal pathogens, and there are treatments available for ornamental trees in the springtime. I took this picture because I noticed ambrosia beetles on white birch on my own property, and they always go in through the lenticels for some reason. And there's one right there. Just one quick slide on rots. So there are various different rots caused by various fungi, but you can break them all down into either white rots or brown rots, 2 main types of rots. So the difference, well, wood has 3 main ingredients: cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. So the white rots digest all 3 of those about equally, right? So the wood turns into something that doesn't look like wood anymore. It's white, punky. You can take 2 fingers and push them straight in. Versus brown rot, those fungi do not really digest the lignin. So it still looks like wood. You can recognize it as wood, but it's brown and very brittle. And it breaks up into rectangles and triangles and cubes. So we have all kinds of examples, but I just like foraging for mushrooms, so I always have to sneak some pictures in. But we have top left, chicken of the woods. Bottom left is hen of the woods or maitoc mushroom. Bottom right is Ganoderma. So a lot of the perennial conchs that look like this, that look like they have a stalk, it's a species of Ganoderma. And then the top right, what's that on birch? That's chaga. So I saw a great presentation a couple weeks ago, and there's some people who also saw it, I think, in the room. And it was made very clear, chaga does not have a symbiotic relationship with birch trees. Chaga is a parasite. It causes disease and decline of trees. It is absolutely not a symbiotic relationship. But it is edible. So ermine moth, have folks ever seen this on usually Euonymus europaeus spindle tree? Looks like it's been decorated for Halloween with that really fine webbing. It's ermine moth. So if you see, it's really going to be on spindle tree, which is an uncommonly planted ornamental. But you'll see it's really, really gregarious feeding. And by the time you notice it, it's pretty much done. So don't worry about it. Mentioned bacterial wetwood, also known as slime flux. This is caused by a whole suite of bacteria, actually, bacterial issue. Bacteria get into the heartwood, Pseudomonas, Anthomonas, others, reproduce, and they create a condition where there's too much pressure. The turgor is too high, and so the water pressure is relieved through wherever the weakest parts are to get out. So insect holes, branch stubs, wounds. It's not normally colored, but a lot of times that liquid, that sort of bacterial and tree sap that's pushed out is colonized by secondary fungi that are colorful. So it's kind of neat to see that. So we have lots of different woolly aphids. Aphids have piercing, sucking mouth parts. The woolly aphids create this waxy flocculence, this white stuff that looks like Q-tips a little bit to hide. Woolly alder aphid on the left. On the right is beech blight aphid, which is actually not a serious thing. It's not associated with beech bark disease. But if you disturb these guys, and there are hundreds of them on that little branch, they all do the wave together in unison to, I guess, scare you away. We have a lot of sawflies out there too. Dogwood sawfly, red oak sawfly, red-headed pine sawfly, European pine sawfly. They're all gregarious feeders. And this is another one where it can look like the most terrifying thing because you look out at your favorite tree and it's all of a sudden covered one day with hundreds or thousands, many thousands of sawflies. And by the time you notice it and call somebody and ask what to do about it, usually in 1 or 2 days, they're just done feeding for the year and they've moved on. But they don't actually do that much damage typically. And the way you can diagnose or identify sawfly, all insects have 6 true legs, 3 pairs of true legs. So those are the jointed legs in the front, right behind the head. Then everything else behind that, those are prolegs. So you can count the prolegs, and if you have more than 5 sets of prolegs, that's in general going to be a sawfly, especially if it's a social feeder. We have lots of leaf galls and spots caused by various mites, like this on sugar maple and red maple sometimes. I call it velvet gall. It looks like pool table material, but it's sort of bright purplish red. Different spindle galls, lots of galls on beech leaves, alder, elm, none of which are serious. Midges are flies. This is caused by the maple eye spot gall midge. It looks like a target when it's fresh early in the summer, and then it drops out, turns brown, and eventually can drop out. Nothing to worry about, but good to know what it is. We have some late season skeletonizing moths as well. Again, anything that happens late in the season to the leaves is not going to be a big deal, but they can be really noticeable when populations bump up for whatever reason. So a few years ago, we had a lot of this is beech leaf tire. So they sort of laminate leaves together to create a safe environment in which to feed. Another big one is the maple trumpet skeletonizer, another late season issue. Last but not least, this I had to put this in for you, just for you guys. This came in like 3 weeks ago. Somebody wanted to know what was happening with their moth. I said, "Did you see the show? Has anybody here seen The Last of Us?" What was, does anybody remember the name of that fungus that was causing people? Cordyceps, yeah. So that, luckily, that was not real, right? There aren't any cordyceps for people, but they call these zombie moths because cordyceps kills these moths, but before it kills it, it does something in the brain, tells the moth, go crawl up something to a height of 5 to 10 feet, hold on tight and die. And then I'm going to create these structures to shower spores out in the world more effectively. Pretty spooky. I'm glad I'm a mammal sometimes. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Ron Klamarsik. No, emerald ash borer won't eliminate all the ash because we'll always have small ash growing up, and ash rust will affect any ash leaf that's out there, including also ash trees that have been treated, protected. Did I see another hand up before? There's a hand up in the back. So the question is, are there any examples of situations where one pest will protect the tree from another pest? Nothing is coming to mind immediately. I certainly wouldn't rule that out, though. Trees can mount pretty successful response efforts against insects and diseases. And a lot of those responses would be effective against other things that are incidental or come right afterwards. Yeah. Steve Junkin. So the question is about smooth patch. Does it cause any internal damage? So it's called smooth patch disease, and that's a misnomer. A disease, it has to cause some kind of injury. Smooth patch does not cause any injury at all. It's a good question. All right, one more. Okay, one more in the back.
And I'm wondering if that has any impact at all, to your knowledge, on the plant's treatability, or any of the sugar that we normally store with winter, which impacts the sugar content of the sap.
So the question has to do with maple leaf cutter and whether it has any effect on basically photosynthesis and sap storage. It has to have a little bit of effect, right? Because photosynthesis is a function of your surface area, and if you're removing some of the surface area, you're not making as much sap for next year. But I'm not a sugaring specialist, so I don't know if it affects the sugar content of the sap like that. We actually do have a sugaring specialist here, so I can have him meet up with you. He might have an answer for you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dode. Our next talk, it's going to have Dave Orwig from Harvard Forest come up. He's a senior forest ecologist at the Harvard Forest. His research encompasses broad areas of ecosystem response to natural and human disturbance and environmental change. And he spent 30 years studying the structural, compositional, and ecosystem level impacts of Hemlock woolly Adelgid in New England forests and all the complex interactions that spin off of that. So excited to hear about some hemlock, and welcome, Dave.
Okay, thanks very much. Appreciate that. I really enjoyed that last talk. There's some very cool photos in there, some things that I have seen but didn't quite know what they were. So I really appreciate that. So, I'm a forest ecologist, and I've studied this insect that you see in the upper left-hand side, the Hemlock woolly Adelgid, for almost 30 years. And, much of my time studying has been looking at the forest dynamics that ensue following either the decline or loss of hemlock. And so I was asked to actually give some insight into some chemical treatment options, which I will do, but I also talk about hemlock and some of the large-scale protection efforts that I think we're poised to now do across the landscape. And so this picture on the left is a site from Connecticut in 1995. I used a slide for that way back when to take that picture. And then 10 years later, that same site, most of those hemlocks were gone. This is a place called Foster's Pond in Connecticut. Is it just the right arrow here? Yeah. Okay. And so what I hope to do today is share some insight on hemlock as a species, certainly talk about the threat of Hemlock woolly Adelgid in various parts of New England, and then the different types of treatment options that exist and some larger scale approaches. Once again, I'll be honest, I have not treated hemlocks for 30 years, but I can share what I have found from a lot of people who have been treating hemlock throughout that time period. And of course, as we all know, no surprise in this room, but hemlock is one of those unique species that can create these amazing, unique microenvironments, cast deep shade like you see here on your right. And it's really a very interesting species to study. We consider it a foundation species. This is a species that has great control over the energy flow and microenvironment in a forest, very common in old growth forests. They're one of the longest lived in the East. Does anyone know how old they can actually get in terms of living species? That is correct, Brian. It's more than 500 years. And I'm asking that because we were lucky enough last year to core one that was 651 years old. And I was amazed. I didn't think in my lifetime we'd ever find one that old, but this was in Tionesta in Pennsylvania. And it is amazing. I'll show you a picture of that later. Of course, as I mentioned, it's a foundation species and it has all these other amazing attributes that we like about it in the forest, including the coarse woody debris that it provides, both terrestrial and in aquatic systems. And of course, that shade can moderate temperatures for both other critters and also in streams to keep streams cooler for those cool water fishes like trout. Okay, so this slide never gets old because it really encapsulates the problem that we have with woolly adelgid in one slide. This is a small, very small insect, about 1 millimeter in size, but it can wreak great havoc in our forests. And the reason that is because there's 2 generations a year. Every individual in North America is an obligate female. They can all lay eggs, and they lay a lot of eggs. And so really only cold temperatures are some of the greatest deterrents for woolly adelgids. I'll show you maybe stopping its spread all the way north. But it can feed and kill all sizes and age classes of hemlock. And I will say there's no effective native predators. That's not to say that nothing out there is eating it, but certainly it's not playing a great role in any kind of population control. We don't know much about hemlock resistance. I'm not going to say there's not any. There's a new app that you can find on your phone called Tree Snap, and it's looking for lingering hemlock. And so I encourage people to check that out because it'd be nice to find some of these lingering hemlock to actually find some resistance that exists out there in the wild. And of course, no surprise, it gets its name, woolly adelgid, from the woolly waxy material that it covers itself with. It's on the underside of the branch, so if you lay eggs, you're an adult and you lay eggs without that wool, they just fall off the tree. So this wool helps protect the adult and the eggs that are laid probably in another month or 2. The left-hand side, you can see, is what it would look like right now if we go out there. You see adults that have woolly material that they form through pores in their skin. And then in another month or 2, they're much puffier on the right-hand side. And those are now filled with eggs. And I'll also just point out that we also have scale. You probably can't see too much in the back, but scale is another invasive insect of eastern hemlock that's been around for over a century. In my opinion, it's less of a threat to hemlock trees, but it is a co-occurring pest along with woolly adelgid, the much more damaging pest. And of course, if left untreated, which is kind of the thrust of this talk today, continuous feeding certainly leads to progressive needle loss. You get loss of needles from the inside of the tree and at the bottom of the tree, and you're left with just needles at the edges of branches or at the top of the tree. And I always consider this a chronic pest. The population numbers ebb and flow. It doesn't leave the forest. You may have several years where you can't find it. It's there. And this is the big problem that we have with woolly adelgid. And again, this is, cause all kinds of problems within the tree in terms of reduced shoot growth, aggressive needle loss. Trees can survive longer than I would have originally anticipated. Certainly, we have trees at Harvard Forest that have had adelgid for almost 20 years now. Some sites in Connecticut that have been falling for 25 years have a few trees left. It's usually 8 to 15 years. But we are seeing trees survive longer, which is a good thing. But typically, once it's in a forest, it'll continue to cause decline of those trees. And of course, the same is true for understory trees. It's not just the big trees. You go from patches of green saplings on the left to kind of these skeletonized forests on the right, where those saplings also succumb to the woolly adelgid. And same is true with this small seedling that you see here at the bottom. And I'll just point out that clearly we know that hemlock likes riparian forests and is often the dominant species along aquatic areas. And so there's a site near Amherst that a friend of mine took pictures of at the same place, 15 years apart or so. And we see that loss. This is in the wintertime. You would expect to see green needles of an evergreen tree on the right, and they're no longer there. They're going to start falling into this stream. They probably already have. Okay, so let's look at some of the most recent distribution maps. This is just from a few months ago. And no surprise, most of the southern range of hemlock has been at least infested with woolly adelgid. This is at the county scale. We do see out in Michigan, we continue to see adelgid in Michigan. My understanding, and this was done strictly from moving infested saplings into Michigan. Explain that one to me. I don't understand it. It makes no sense. And that's how Adelgid got there. Nova Scotia, as you can see here too, is also really getting heavily infested. Major tree mortality is occurring there. And so that's a real issue for these maritime areas that get warmer winter temperatures. But we'll see here in New England, southern half of New England is largely filled in. Northern half, though, we still have some areas of the Hemlock range that has not been infested yet. And we can look at more closely. Let's start with Maine. We can see that certainly it's a coastal phenomenon as it heads down east. It's still not migrating too much further north yet, but it's certainly migrating east. And if the winter trends hold, it'll continue to start moving north. I've seen it near Belfast myself. And so it's definitely going to be a problem for at least southern Maine, if not further north. Same is true with these other, where we are here in Vermont, the southern third or so has been infested. I saw it in Townsend State Forest, I think 10 years ago. And so it's clearly been in the state for a while. Cold, we certainly think is playing a role, but again, our winters like this one have not been that cold. And so we certainly think it'll continue to migrate north. And the same general pattern is true with New Hampshire. Really found in the southern part of the state and continues to migrate north now, almost to Winnipesaukee, if I'm not mistaken. And so there's certainly parts of New England that don't have it yet, but the threat is there, and Hemlock is certainly at risk. And so take a pause here to think about, like, I'm talking about Hemlock. We've heard about ash a little bit before. These are all imperiled species that are being threatened by introduced insects and disease. And it's been estimated that 40% of the living biomass in North America is at risk from introduced pests and disease. This is a big issue, and no surprise to people in this room. But what I feel we can offer now is, we're at a point where I think it's just unacceptable to just let these things die off. And so there is an ongoing effort to at least, let's make it a priority to where we can try to protect some of these species. We can't over much of the landscape, but we can start prioritizing areas to try to protect through a variety of different reasons and ways. And so this framework on the left is from a paper that Tony and I and many other great collaborators did last year, talking about the framework for species preservation in general, including hemlock. And we can start out with things like, well, there's preservation values that we want to try to maintain on the landscape. For example, ecological function. There's approaches to try to keep those values present. For example, you may want to maintain the health and vigor of host species. And then there's various strategies you can take to try those approaches to preserve those values. And so this is the overall framework. On the right, you can get a little bit more into the different types of preservation values. There's ecological functions. Hemlock is a conifer. If you want to maintain that function in the stand, if you're going to lose it, you might want to consider replacing with other, shade-tolerant conifers, for example. There's genetic preservation. A lot of these species are being eliminated, but a few survive. And so we want to maintain some of the genetics on the landscape. This is one way we can start doing it. There's a myriad of cultural values that are at risk from the loss of these trees. And so that's of paramount importance as well. And I feel that many of us feel there's an ethical responsibility to try to maintain these species, at least in patches across the landscape. And so what can be done? So there's a variety of different things you can use, either on your trees in your backyard or in your forest. And I'm not really going to be advocating for anything necessarily. I'm trying to present you what I know is being done and what are some of the maybe pluses and minuses that exist out there. Certainly the first thing that's often tried because it's cheaper are things called contact insecticides. These are things you spray on a tree to actually suffocate the insect itself. So of course, if there is more than one insect on that tree, you're also going to suffocate those too. So throughout this conversation, we're going to be considering trade-offs. And so soaps and oils are cheap. You can spray them on trees. The right-hand picture here, you can see those are trees that are clearly reachable with a hose. You would probably get pretty good treatment of a chemical. I'd say the tree on the left, it'd be very questionable you can reach the top of that tree with that hose. And so I'll just point out that you need full coverage to get adequate treatment. You need to do it at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. And so this is going to be something that is certainly doable, but it costs money and it need to be repeated a lot. And then keeping in mind, there are potential non-target effects because of getting complete coverage is pretty challenging. It is often done along, within campgrounds or along roads and things like that. It just needs to be repeated. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Okay, the next type of chemical treatment for Adelgid is usually these neonicotinoids. The systemics, these are taken up within the tree through various ways, and the insects that are feeding on the twigs will take in that chemical and subsequently die. And so one of the ones that's used a lot is imidacloprid, also called Merit, the original one. Now there are some generic alternatives. And this chemical is applied in a variety of different ways, from soil applications that you see in the middle to soil injections that can be done. And so the way this is done is that you inject these into the soil or the roots. It's very slowly taken up into the tree. This chemical takes sometimes up to a year or a little bit longer to get full coverage within the tree. And of course, if you're doing soil applications, you also have the potential for leakage and non-target effects. What do I mean by that? There's other insects in the soil, they're killed off too. So again, there's a trade-off. So you want the 300-year-old tree to die, or do you want to keep the insects alive in the soil? And, if you're studying rare insects and they're there, maybe that is the option that you want to take. But those things have to be weighed when you're trying to come up with these decisions. I'll just point out that there is emerging work with a basal spray of imidacloprid as well. But so these are two applications of soil treatments. There's actually also something called a soil drench. I had a student work with me, I don't know, 10 years ago, who worked for the Park Service. And what they did all summer, because you can go to these remote areas, as long as you have some of the powdered chemical and water, you can pour it around the base of the tree. And again, it is taken up into the tree. And even though it takes months, it's a really good deterrent of Adelgid for 4 to 6. Now I've heard up to 7 years of protection with one application. And so while it would need to be repeated likely, it's not every year. You get many years of protection with one application. I mentioned the elongate hemlock scale is also often growing with woolly Adelgid. This particular type of chemical will do nothing to that insect. So if you knock out the Adelgid, sometimes scale we see increase quite a bit following treatment of woolly Adelgid. I don't know if that necessarily would end up killing the tree, in my opinion, but certainly it's just another pest to deal with. If you're dealing with soil applications, again, you do have these potential leakage. You would not want to use this approach near streams. It can move into streams. It could be dangerous to the invertebrates in the streams as well. And there are potential non-target effects. There's also a Cortec time release tablet you can see here on the right. I believe this was actually designed more for nursery use, but certainly a lot of people started to use it. You put the little tablet in the soil, it dissolves slowly, and then it's taken up into the tree as well. My understanding is they also have fertilizer in them. So it's not like a willy-nilly, you want to use that everywhere. You got to be careful if you're also fertilizing while you're doing it. So, but that is certainly an effective treatment in certain situations. I mentioned hemlock likes to grow along water. None of those applications are useful along water. So you would go to something called like a stem injection system. And there's a myriad of them. I only show 3 of them here. There's something called like a tree IV for obvious reasons. It kind of looks like an IV here on the left. Various injection technologies that are being used to either under pressure or otherwise injecting the chemical into the tree. And there's one called Ecoject here on the right. And so these are more desirable for trees in sensitive situations or near aquatic systems because you have less risk for chemical runoff in those situations. Okay, this is a busy slide, but I'm only showing it to just point out that there are a variety of chemicals of imidacloprid that exist out there on the landscape. And I only want you to just see the names of them across the top. And then also just to think about, I'm not an expert on the cost, but this table very nicely talks about cost per inch of diameter. And so oftentimes when you're treating, it's based on how big the tree is. And so, you may not be able to even see these numbers, but it's roughly somewhere between 30 and say 60 cents an inch to treat with imidacloprid in these forms. And so, you can think about a modest sized tree maybe for $10, which, 30 years ago, that wasn't the case. Okay, and that was imidacloprid. Now we're switching to another systemic insecticide that's often used. That's dimetephuron. the original trade name of that was Safari. This is much more fast acting. It's water soluble. It can be taken up into the tree within weeks. And so this is often used when you have a tree that you want to protect that has high Adelgid. And since this is very fast acting, you would maybe use a basal spray with this that's absorbed in through the bark and it's taken up into the tree pretty quickly. It doesn't stay in the tree for very long though. So you would probably use this for these, again, heavily infested trees. And then you'd follow up probably with other chemicals if you want to maintain that protection. This one, because it's fast acting, can also kill off elongate hemlock scale. So I think it's often used for that as well. And then just through talking with folks, I believe in some places anyway, there's an effort to mix imidacloprid and dinetefuran for some basal sprays. I don't know if that's official or if that's something that's emerging, but I just thought I'd mention it as something maybe coming. And again, just similarly, not quite as many options, but there are plenty of different options for dinetefuran, but suffice it to say that they're actually a little bit more expensive to treat per inch. But if you're only going to be using on the really heavily infested trees that you want to protect right away, maybe that's a one-time cost. Then you'll have cheaper costs with subsequent treatment, maybe with other types of chemicals. There's just one other product that I thought I'd mention. It's azadirachtin. This is actually derived from a tree, for the seed extracts of the neem tree. I'll be honest, I don't know where neem grew either, but it's in India. But the seed extracts of this tree can provide some protection against different types of insects. It's only recently been talked about for woolly adelgid. That's why I thought I'd at least mention it. It has rapid translocation within the tree, but again, short duration, kind of like dinetefuran. It's more expensive. And it's, again, usually used against adelgid in these aquatic situations, from what I understand. Has anyone ever used this product? Oh, okay. Just curious. So I'm not positive about this, but I thought I'd mention it because it seems like it's somewhat an emerging product. And so we're at the point we can treat trees. I think we should be treating trees. Like someone mentioned to me 10 years ago, if we could have protected chestnut, but we just decided to heck with it, I'm not going to do it. And then they all died off. Wouldn't we be kind of upset today? And that's kind of where we stand. And I understand there's a lot of hemlock on the landscape still, but I don't want to be in that situation where we could have protected some of these great old growth groves and just decide, I'm not going to because it costs money. And so I want to try to point out that we can change that dynamic a little bit and talk about these approaches that are used at larger scales to protect species. And so in that same paper that Tony and others have done, we started talking about these landscape efforts for a variety of different reasons. You can preserve ecological function by protecting certain trees in a stand. And then across the landscape, you can start protecting pockets of trees across the landscape. In fact, that's already being done with ash. I'm going to take a sidestep with ash just to say this is the approach that's being done with ash. Caitlin provided this nice slide. It's a really neat effort to try to protect ash at different parts of the landscape. It's the same thing we can do with adelgid and with other trees. So you get a variety of partners that are willing to either pool resources or try to get the same treatments going, and then you can start to protect various species across the landscape. And we should be planning this. We should be advocating for this, and we should continue to try to do this. You know, back to hemlock woolly adelgid, I thought I'd just point out a few large-scale efforts you may or may not have heard of. This is up in Nova Scotia, as I point out. That's really kind of spreading across the southern half of Nova Scotia. And Donna Crossan, I talked to multiple times. Their goal is to actually treat and protect 2,000 hectares of hemlock annually. Now, this is a scale that was never mentioned 10 years ago because it was too costly. It's not too costly anymore. And so they prioritize a bunch of different sites based on a lot of different criteria. Do you want it in old growth? Do you want it in different landscapes? Do you want it in areas of cultural significance like Micmac or other areas? What type of species might be there? And so the example on the right here is this amazing effort where they had a ton of volunteers help out. They treated 2,000 trees in 10 days. So those types of efforts are possible with the right resources and initiative to get that kind of protection efforts going. Down south, there's this great organization, Hemlock Restoration Initiative. Margot Walson heads that up, and they've protected tens of thousands of hemlocks. And throughout the year, they're out there with crews. And again, you need a water bottle and some chemical, and you're able to go and at least, depending how you want to do it, you can protect groves of trees across the landscape, and that can be done. Shenandoah Park National Trust, same thing. Almost 30,000 trees treated in a variety of different ways. And I'm mentioning it now because we still have time in parts of New England. We may not be up against it like some of these areas down south, but we should be starting to think about a concerted and maybe a planned effort to try to get some of these protection efforts going. I'll also just point out one in Massachusetts, Ice Glen. It's a town in Western Mass near Stockbridge. And, this is a grove of old growth hemlocks that I actually helped sample many years ago, and also has ash in it. And the town decided, and others, that they would like to try to protect these trees before they're gone. And so through a combination of town and USDA funds, they treated 400 hemlock and 50 large ash. Ultimately, we don't know if that'll be successful, but it's at least an effort, and hopefully the town will continue to try to provide resources for that. And they had the interest to try it, and they're moving forward with it. Harvard Forest, for years, we didn't treat anything, but moving forward in the next couple of years, we are going to treat some of our forests with the various chemical treatments to try to protect some hemlock on the landscape. And I guess somewhat in closing, we know that Adelgid continues to feed and spread north and kill hemlock. And there's plenty of areas that still don't have it, but I just think we should be thinking about ways to maybe try to protect parts of the landscape, maybe at different aspects, different tree sizes, tree ages, different characteristics. They can be done. It would need to be repeated, but not annually, typically. And so you can start to think now to pool, resources, partners, maybe fundraising, and prioritize sites. I did want to point out, again, I'm not a licensed applicator, but you do need in many of these states to be a licensed applicator of pesticides. So I try to put some links here. It varies by state. It also changes. And so I do want to be very clear about the fact that you can't just willy-nilly, I can't just go out there and start treating things. You need to have responsible application of that through certified applicators. The other thing to keep in mind is some of those chemicals have a per acre limit per year. So if you're planning on protecting a large area, you likely will not be able to do all of it in the same year because of that per acre limit. So you need to start, that's another reason to start planning. You need to may go back in multiple years. You do this section 1 year, this section another year, this section another year. Something to think about. Whoops. And I just want to thank, NESAF, Caitlin for asking me to do it. HFLTR has really provided a lot of the funding to do a lot of the work that I've been doing over the time. And then I talked to a variety of different forest health practitioners and arborists and things just to give some feedback on what is being used or what hasn't being used. This plot, I just want to point out, this is the oldest forest plot I've ever been in. The center tree there is the 651. The one next to it is 540. And there were 3 other trees that were over 400 in a 20 meter diameter plot. And so these things do exist out there. I'm going to be talking to NESAF. They already protect other trees. So I'm going to certainly make them aware of this site to try to protect these moving forward into the future. And I'll be happy to take questions. Brian.
Predatory beetles.
As biocontrol? Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I was asked to focus on the chemical side, but certainly there's a variety of different beetles that have been released over time, particularly Laricobius beetles and silverflies. It's nice to have those combinations because one will eat one generation and one will eat the other generation. Because if you only eliminate one generation, they can rebound really quickly. And so silverflies in combination with Laricobius are probably the most promising beetles. I could ask Ryan, who's here, who works for the state of New Hampshire, but I think those are the most prominent ones that are being used. They're able to find them again. Certainly down south in the Mid-Atlantic, they can go to the areas they've released these beetles. They can find them again in enough quantities that they can then re-release those elsewhere. So there is some hope on the horizon for sure with some of those beetles. Yeah.
Are there any decision-making frameworks out of there in terms of like, you've got an infested stand, at what point Is it too late to start chemical treatments?
Right.
Point, is it too costly to start them early because you don't want to be doing this stuff?
Yeah, it's a great question. The question's about, is there a decision framework for when to begin the treatments, or is it maybe perhaps, is there a threshold where perhaps it's too late? I mean, certainly after you lose 75% of the crown, it's very unlikely you're going to get recovery of that hemlock. Now, I would love if someone has an example of that, because I don't want to be always saying that, but that's my understanding. Certainly, you know, if you have a tree that's really starting to thin, you have high Adelgid, you probably would want to use something like dimetephuron to knock them out and then start to provide some more longer term protection.
You have to wait if you have visible infestation.
Yeah, treating without Adelgid really doesn't make any sense. You're wasting chemical, your potential non-target effects, it doesn't make any sense. So you would wait till you saw Adelgid on the tree. Yeah.
7 years ago, I remember there was some talk about either introducing a hemlock species from either out west or from Asia, or splicing in genetic materials, or like any like the chestnuts. I was just wondering if that's still something that's being talked about, or if that's tried.
Yeah, so the question is about whether there have been efforts to introduce either hemlocks from out west or maybe crossed species. I can tell you the eastern hemlock does not cross with anything. So the cross that has been produced is a Chinese Carolina hemlock cross that are now, some of these are fairly full-size individuals. My only question to everybody in the room is, what is that really? A Chinese Carolina cross is not the answer to repopulate the landscape, in my opinion, with hemlock. Western hemlocks just don't grow well here. They can survive in arboretum, but they just don't grow well. Carolina hemlock is susceptible to woolly adelgid as well. And so I just feel like that's a tougher sell for me as a long-term solution. It's a great question, though. I think there's one over here. Yeah.
They're producing silviculture proactively ahead of
Yeah.
infestation to
Yeah.
reduce the health.
Yeah, so the question is on silviculture. One anecdote and then an answer. You know, in 1995, I started studying woolly adelgid, and I was on these federal task force and I was saying we should really investigate silviculture, and I was like basically laughed out of the room because all I wanted to do was, you know, release biocontrolling chemicals, which I understand. However, there's growing awareness now that if you have small gaps that can provide more light and better health for those hemlock trees, it does confer an advantage to at least surviving woolly adelgid for longer periods of time. I'm not going to say it's the end all yet. I'm not convinced it'll actually protect it long term, but it certainly provides an avenue for the trees to survive longer. And maybe with enough of those efforts, there's certainly a lot of ongoing work down south for that silviculture. So there's a lot of ideas of creating these small gaps to create better health of at least understory hemlocks for that reason. High light, high temperatures also tend to keep adelgid down. Not completely, but anything that we can do to provide better health for the tree, we should think about. So yeah, there's ongoing work with that.
I've got some hemlock stands and it's so dense, there's absolutely no regeneration, nothing green growing underneath. And I've been, some of the stands are infested, some aren't, but they're nearby. So I've been taking out the larger trees and hopefully creating openings to get some regeneration of any species. I'll leave any non-hemlock species to try to regenerate the forest in case we do get a massive die-off. Something else going underneath.
Yeah, so the observation was that within these dense hemlock stands, he's taken out some of the large ones, creating gaps for some of the smaller trees and other regeneration to occur. I've done a lot of examination of harvested areas, and certainly areas that create small gaps leads very often to high hemlock regeneration. Now they're susceptible to woolly adelgid, but other regeneration can often occur there too. So I do think we should plan more silvicultural studies so we can robustly look at those findings. Sometimes it's a little ad hoc and we can't quite say, oh, it's because of that gap, but I think we should do more of that for sure. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is whether we're going to be doing silviculture at Harvard Forest. I think the short answer is no. We've done a lot of work actually removing hemlock to simulate woolly adelgid, and then we've studied it in place as they deteriorate. And so I think our next approach is to actually protect other parts of our forest. But there are opportunities out there for sure that we could try to find partners and try to do some additional silviculture. There was a study in Quabbin Reservoir that tried to look at some silviculture. I believe that work is ongoing. It was Rosemary Musica, but we'll probably not be doing silviculture for that. Yep. Yep. Yeah, I'm probably going to punt to Ryan. The one I know of are naturally occurring fungi. I've seen scale killed off with naturally occurring fungi. I don't know about other.
Control programs kind of being resurrected to some extent right now. There was a lot that was released, but unfortunately, they don't synchronize well with the scale in the United States, and so they are very variable in their parity, like anywhere from 3 to 9%. We might have a good year, but there's many more years where it's really low parasitism. There's a bunch of predators and parasitoids that were identified, and so hopefully researchers are going to go back in there and try and find something that be added to the program.
Thanks, Ryan.
I'm just curious, you mentioned that the species is not like a female in North America. Would that make them at all more susceptible to like a pathogen from their native range?
I mean, in theory, if we could find one of those, it would be great. I mean, I think that's true, but there hasn't been much control out there besides the stuff that's been introduced and cold temperatures. And when I say cold, 20 to 30 below zero is what we really need in more than 1 year. So that's kind of what we need. But I think you're right.
Further questions about biocontrol. So like, what is the horizon for biocontrol being broadly out of the landscape? Like, you know, we have chemicals that are going to last for 6 years. Could we anticipate that a single treatment might resist biocontrol? 2 treatments?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is about long-term outlook on biocontrol and if we can get some stopgap measure with these chemical treatments. I mean, that's the overall goal. Integrated pest management, chemicals to kind of knock off the Adelgid, at least at lower levels. You need some Adelgid there to feed the biocontrol though as well. And so, you know, I think it's going to take a multi-pronged effort of chemicals and biocontrol and cold winters, which we're probably not going to get. Until something else comes along, either fungi or something else. I know if Ryan, who works in biocontrol, if he has anything else to add on that.
The silver flies are relatively new, those for the past 4 or 5 years now. I'm hopeful that they will be the more effective predator in our area. They seem more cold tolerant. They're 2 generations a year, just like the Adelgid, but that's still years in the making. We will really have good preliminary data for probably 5, maybe even 10 years. But I'm hoping it's so flies.
Yeah.
Do you feel that the benefits of riparian zone hemlock justify the risk of the soil injection?
Can you repeat the first part?
Yeah, do you feel that the benefits of hemlock and riparian justify the risk of the?
Yeah, so the question is whether, you know, treating in riparian areas, you know, justifies, you know, that because they often grow in these riparian areas. I would say, in certain situations, I would say yes. I mean, what are they? I may come up with a different idea than Brian or Rand or Alex. Certainly, if there's old growth trees growing there, I'm very biased towards old growth because I study it a lot. But maybe you have rare species growing along, you know, in and around hemlock that really likes that shade, and you want to maintain that. I think in some situations it is worth doing. There is the technology to do it via stem injection. I would not be advocating trying to protect all the riparian hemlock. It just wouldn't make sense. But you can protect areas that you place as a high priority. I think it can be done. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I was thinking. It's like 4 or 5 years. Yeah. Fair enough. All your lives.